Thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Mina Mohammed, for your opening remarks. Good morning, everybody. My name is Janet Macharia, server CEO of TNIF. I also teach in my spare time, I guess, international trade law, and I'm happy to see one or two students in the room. We take note of the fact that we have an online audience, and to notice that part of this panel is also connected online. And I hope that we are all set and that they are ready to commence or to join us. I'll start with an introduction of our esteemed panelists. This panel is meant to set the tone, if you will, for the day. We already had the agenda we have for this day, and really we're talking about development and reform and AFCFTA and other objectives that are ongoing in the continent. So I'll start with an introduction of the panelists, and to my immediate left is Dr. Jody, who is helping me with moderation, but will also give us her own reflections as we continue. Then next we have George Riddell, Advisory Board Member of TNIF, but also Managing Director of Goida Limited. Next we have Dr. Patrick Lowe, formerly Chief Economist at the WTO, also an Advisory Board Member. Ambassador Dr. Mina Mohammed has very graciously agreed to join us for this session as well and give her own reflections about the reform discussion. I'm going to stick my feet. I have to come from the and I'm doing it for you. Okay. I welcome Rosalind now. From the AFCFTA. I'll give you a few minutes to collect your thoughts. Don't you worry, I won't be very tough, don't worry. As she gets situated, I'm going to introduce our online panelists. We have Ratnakara Adhikari, Executive Director of Enhanced Integrated Framework. Very happy to have you with us, and I hope that you can hear us. Then we have Carleen, Director at TES, based in Geneva. Happy to see that you are able to join us as well, Carleen. And I'll start with you, Patrick. I'll start with you because, and the reason I want to start with you is because you've spent a lot of time in the corridors, the WTO, listening to the discussions that are going on about reform, and even now that are going on about reform. So my question is, whether you can give us your own reflections on the reform process to date. How optimistic are you about MC14? Maybe you can start us off.
Working, yeah. You put me on the spot, haven't you? Thank you, Janet. That was very thoughtful. It's true that I've roamed the corridors for a long time. I first joined the GATT in 1980, which is quite a few years ago, and I left in 2013. I've more or less kept in touch, but I'm not sure my knowledge is as perfect as Janet is suggesting of where we are now. The truth is, you can't really talk about the WTO. Nobody talks about the WTO these days without using words like reform and crisis. And this is true. We try to trace this gradual decline. I mean, you know, we can always put different dates on it, but I would say it's the beginning of this century when we tried to launch a negotiating round called the Doha round, which failed. Then I think, quite honestly, the kind of the main driving force of the multilateral trading system for many years, the United States, has been showing increasing signs of disinterest. And I think this probably 10, 15 years ago, and has intensified since. So right now, Geneva seeking to identify what the sources of the crisis are. It's useful, but the problem is it's a mishmash. There's no prioritization. It's just a basic listing of whatever anyone wants to put on that list as to what is wrong with the system. And I think the next challenge, the challenge for the upcoming ministerial meeting, will be to put some flesh on this and to get some priorities. And I think all these priorities have to be linked to the three core functions of the system, which are negotiations, administration of the agreement and dispute settlement. And in all cases, there are real difficulties. We can talk about them later if you wish, but I don't want to take all my time talking about the specifics of what those crises are. I'd like to first of all just say that the situation has become markedly worse since President Trump's first term. The core problem that we now face in the WTO, or a core problem, is the national security provisions. The national security provisions it's the only provision where you really are the own judge of your own case. You are the one who has to say that you have a national security problem. And when this is abused and used in the way it has been by the United States, clearly we have a crisis on our hands. And this started in Trump 1 with restrictions on aluminium and steel, predicated on the notion of national security threats, which I don't think many people found very convincing. But the problem then was that all the countries that were hit by this responded in ways which were not necessarily WTO consistent. The EU used safeguards in a way which didn't really conform with the norms. Australia, Brazil, they used quantitative export restraints, which are supposed to be illegal. So you began to get a general breakdown in respect for the system. And this then became even more acute in Trump 2, where Trump 1 hadn't done too much damage to most favored nation principles, some, but not too much. What has happened now is a systematic disregard for the most favored nation principle and the non-discrimination principle, which in many ways is the core starting point for a system of international trade cooperation, that everyone treats everyone else in the same way. That has certainly gone out the window. Now, if we look a little bit at where Africa stands, what's of interest to the continent, I mean, I think the AFCFTA is an extremely important element in and of itself. Just thinking in purely in African terms, Africa is one of the continents that has the least intra-African, intra-continental trade. There are plenty of reasons why this is the case, and I think that's one of the things that's going to be fixed. Clearly, the AFCFTA, when it comes into full effect, will be a powerful voice, because there are many ways in which the continent can speak, which is much more difficult as of now. And so individual African countries pushing positions, it's not necessarily going to be that effective, but I see great promise with an AFCFTA. And of course, the WTO is important for all countries, as Ambassador was saying. We can't, if we didn't have the system, which, as I say, is increasingly at peril, it's very difficult to see how countries are going to benefit individually and collectively from international specialization through trade. So I think that's a real issue. I just want to say something very briefly about special and differential treatment. It is the case that most of the least developed countries, or many of the least developed countries, are located in Africa, and there is a regime for the least developed countries which is unique. But then the whole question of special and differential treatment more generally, I think it's been a source of considerable contention, but I'm not sure that all the contention has been entirely necessary. You see, when it comes to regulation, all the regulatory aspects of trade, things like anti-dumping, countervailing duties, customs valuation, and licensing, are essentially propositions for convergence of all members around the same rules. There'll be different speeds for getting there, and then there's obviously the least developed countries an exception to this. So as far as the rules are concerned, the challenge is to make sure the rules make sense from a national interest point of view in their formation. It isn't so much a question of whether or not you're allowed to have special and differential treatment, given the convergence proposition, which makes me think that a lot of the problem with a lot of the difficulty with special differential treatment is different countries trying to persuade other countries to reduce their trade barriers, their tariffs, essentially. And that's what the case is. But you know, but in that sense, every country has special differential treatment. I don't know why I'm making such a fuss about it. You know, if you look at the tariff levels of the European Community and the United States in fruit, vegetables, agricultural products, labor-intensive manufacturers, they're massive. They go up to 40%. So, we could so call that special differential treatment. So I think we should bear that in mind when it comes to special differential treatment. I think the two things that are on the agenda today are really important because they're emerging issues, and I think it's a real opportunity to take a serious account of how these affect the bundling. I mean, this is going to be discussed, so I'll say very little. All I'll say is that it's extraordinary how little attention is paid to adaptation in the climate change discussions, considering that Africa is only responsible for way below 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. The real challenge for Africa is going to be adaptation. Why don't we talk about it? So that's anyway, I just wanted to put that down. And then digital's a huge opportunity. And linked to digital, I can just say, I think that if I were not too old to be a scholar still, I would be thinking seriously about how to harness trade in services, because services account, and the richer a country gets, the more of that services account for income. And I think we tend to neglect them, and they're often hidden in statistics behind descriptions of manufactured products or physical products. So that would be something that I think could really help. And finally, decision making. We are going to have to face up to the difficulty that one of the major reasons why the WTO has had such difficulty in making progress is because of the consensus principle. It only takes one country to block a decision. We should be thinking more creatively about how to address that problem. There are ideas out there, but this is probably not the time to discuss them. I think I've done. Thank you. Taking my time.
Yes. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. All of these are very interesting points, different agenda items, I would say. But moving to you now, and I'm still giving Rosaline 2-3 minutes to gather her thoughts, because we've talked about the AFCFTA and we'd love to hear your views on this. But I'm going to move to you, George, now, and talk about it from the private sector point of view, and ask that, given your work and experience with the businesses, whether you can give us sort of like a reality check on what do you think is possible, what is realistic for MC14, and what do they want, the businesses?
Does that work? Yeah. Thank you. And thank you to TNIF and ODI for organizing today. I do think it's an incredibly timely moment to have this conversation. I think it's worth just taking a step back, asking about the experiences of the private sector at the moment when it comes to international trade. The last 12, 14 months have been absolutely brutal. You have seen massive upheavals, not just from the US, obviously all of the tariffs that have come into force, the suspension of AGOA, the preference schemes with the African Growth Opportunities Act. You have had just a huge amount of change coming through the system, and not just on the tariffs themselves. I think that's really important, but also when you're talking about goods, it's on rules of origin are undergoing a massive upheaval, including non-preferential rules of origin, in particular how the US, EU, and others look at calculating those in order to gain access to any preferences where they still exist, but also increasing services, trade barriers around the world. The Global Trade Alert's done some really good work looking at how, in particular around data flows, you are just seeing a gradual expansion of those barriers and a reduction in the opportunities for international trade. So we have a very challenging backdrop when it comes to how companies are reacting to that. Countries are also driving an economic security agenda in many places around the world. that has impacts on things like how they approach critical minerals, how they approach their subsidy regimes. Really, it is becoming, it is no longer an international environment of free or gradually freeing trade. We are in an environment where the barriers seem to be only going up, with sort of small glimmers of hope and light, like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, that are able to walk against that broader global backdrop. I completely agree with Patrick around, the United States is not really present in the WTO at the moment. Their leadership role when it came to driving outcomes is no longer there. They're not completely absent. I think that is important to say, that when you look at some of the bilateral deals that they've done, they do still include commitments around the WTO as part of those deals, whether that's a commitment to the moratorium on electronic commerce or a commitment to ratify the fisheries agreements. When you go through those individual deals, there are still glimmers of hope, I would say, in terms of US engagement with the WTO, but that cannot be taken for granted. Coming against this backdrop, how are businesses reacting? It is striking that 72% of world trade still happens on WTO rules. So against all of this and the decline of the WTO and that slow, gradual, breakdown in the decision-making function since the launch of the Doha round, 72% of trade still happens on WTO rules. And I think that is important to remember, particularly because the spaghetti bowl of different FTAs and trade agreements and regional arrangements are expensive for businesses to comply with. Getting preferential rules of origin when you're having to sort of navigate across 10 different agreements is quite expensive for businesses. Navigating across 20 different data localization regimes is expensive. So where you can still use those multilateral rules, whether you know it or not, and I think a lot of businesses don't know that they're using WTO rules, it remains important for businesses to think about how do they navigate internationally. And a lot of the technical underpinnings of the organization still do function quite well, whether that's technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and some of the other WTO agreements. These are not big headline grabbing things, right? They are not sexy. They are not going to get a minister's attention. But for businesses, they can be the life or death, whether you can enter a particular market or not. And I think keeping that in mind as we engage in these reform discussions is incredibly important. And sort of maybe we can delve more into this in due course over the course of the conversation. But what do businesses care about in terms of MC14? They care about outcomes. They don't necessarily care about country positions. They don't care about, is this, in line with the broader international obligations, etc. They go, is it going to make my life easier or cheaper? And I think that's how you keep the business community on side, is not esoteric discussions around special differential treatment. It's about tomorrow, as a result of these new rules, can I trade my products more easily? And I think if you're able to say yes as a government, it is an incredibly powerful voice to bring businesses alongside.
Thank you. Thank you for those reflections, George. And I'm going to move on to you now, Roselyne, on that note, and talk more about the AFCFTA and what role regional initiatives like the AFCFTA play in complementing or reinforcing Africa's negotiating agenda. So we'd like to hear more from you on this issue, and if you picked up any points that you want to reflect on as well, you're allowed to do that.
Thank you very much, Janet. And first of all, let me say thank you very much for allowing us to have a seat at this table, and most importantly, to share about what we have at the continent that is actually shepherding the continent to realize its economic development. The AFCFTA is one of the flagship projects of the Africa Union, and one of the Agenda 2063 is economic development, but not just economic development that provides for sustainability. So I come from that perspective now to answer to this discussion today. Also just drawing from the last panelist of saying businesses do not really care about what you talk about. They don't care about your processes. They don't care about your politics. Business care about facilitation. They care about the bottom line, how your rules are affecting them in terms of the cost of production, in terms of moving across the borders, in terms of them being enabled to invest and to trade in those goods that they have invested. So everything we talk about and all the rules we put in place, the bottom line is what is it impacting on the business community? And so the FCFTA is providing a unified market, and it is providing the rules. So harmonization of the rules, the regulatory space for trade and investment to be undertaken in a seamless manner. So for those of us in the room who are not aware of what the AfCFTA is, it's the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that was signed into force in 2019. It is one really of the most ambitious market integration initiatives after the WTO itself, and it is targeting 1.4 billion people committed to building regional value chains, expanding intra-Africa trade and investment, and it is shifting the African economy away from raw commodity exports towards value-added production and manufacturing. So it gives us that basis. So the negotiations now that are happening under the WTO, if we are not careful about how we position ourselves, that particular vision of moving away from trading in raw commodity into value addition will remain. And if not, we're actually going to go back to being retained, having, for example, technologies that are outdated, technologies that we cannot utilize. We will remain having very expensive processes. And also because of the MRVs, for example, we have the capacity within the continent for us to undertake that. So it gives us that room. So that is my framing. And also to say it is a compact of many of these regulations, protocols that provide almost end-to-end of business entry and exit. So we have the trade in goods protocol, the trade in services, women and youth, competition policy, intellectual property rights policy. Most importantly, and that is where I sit, the investment protocol. And we also have the digital trade. The investment protocol and the digital trade are most relevant in the conversations right now, because what the investment protocol is doing, it is providing the opportunity to align and harmonize the fragmented investment rules that are experienced in the continent now. All our 55 state parties have different varying investment rules. And if you have investors who want to come and take advantage of the unified market, they would also want to ensure that what they experience in different places, because they then invest in different parts of the continent, they would want to be facilitated easily. So it provides those facilitation components. And one of the facilitation areas is under sustainability. What kind of incentives are given to then bolster the regional value chains and that touch on climate matters that are currently on the table? And the second one is a digital trade and the importance of the digital trade gives us then the rules to ensure that we transition into the e-commerce effectively. Two more points that I would like to speak about is what the AfCFTA provides also is the preservation of the policy space for industrialization, because we require that to ensure that we strategically use industrial policy tools, infant industry protection, and the local content measures. So we must then recognize that development is not a one-size-fits-all. So when we're negotiating, it is not a one-size-fits-all. We have different requirements, different economic development in the different countries. So as we negotiate, it's not the same. And I believe it has been talked about that the differential treatment, it is there, but is it operational? Can we be able to operationalize that special and differential treatment? And then the second part is enabling green and inclusive chains, digital green and chains, because Africa's future is here. It lies on digital service trade, green industrialization, which I know we will talk about in the next session. It lies on climate-aligned manufacturing and MSME participation across borders. And then finally, the AFCFTA provides that political opportunity to negotiate a block. You will notice that the AFCFTA was negotiated in a very fast pace. And not only that, it was ratified rather quickly. So far, we have 50 state parties that have ratified in the history of the continent, among the treaties and the negotiations that have been undertaken. So that political goodwill under the AFCFTA, how can we translate it to have that voice, the WTO? Because then that is what will give us that opportunity. So why don't we use the AFCFTA rules as a test bed? Because those are already being integrated within the domestic regulations. So using that and saying, this is what we have already negotiated. This is what is already being implemented within our space. Can we use that in the negotiation instead of negotiating new elements? Let's transition with what we have. So I would like to share that, and I'm available to share others. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind, for all those insights. And I can see now we're set up and we have Khalid and Ratnakar online with us. And I'm going to move over to you, Ratnakar, first, and talk a little bit more about the EIF and how it has contributed to addressing trade-related capacity gaps for African LDCs. So would love to hear your initial reflections on this topic, given the importance of development and accession, for example, of Ethiopia that we've discussed and that came up before. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel really bad not being able to be present there, given the fact that the phase 2 of the EIF was actually, the pledging conference was organized in Nairobi exactly 10 years ago, when Ambassador Dr. Amina Mohammed and Roberto Azevedo co-chaired the event that actually helped us to mobilize $90 million for the phase 3. That was the initial mobilization. So let me start by really thanking ODI and the co-organizers for providing this opportunity, and just want to mention that when Patrick was mentioning about the 3 major pillars of the WTO, I was thinking I wish there was a 4th explicitly mentioned major pillar, which is the trade capacity building as well. And some of these previous DGs, including Azevedo, had used this term as the 4th pillar. So it's a kind of a de facto 4th pillar. So in relation to aid for trade mechanism, EIF has been working with several African countries. Out of the total investment that we've made so far, 67.6% have been invested in Africa so far. And this has remained consistent throughout the phase 1 as well as phase 2, given the fact that 33 members are being supported in Africa. The bulk of the membership is in Africa. So in terms of what we've done so far, 33 the diagnostic trade integration studies have been supported. And 23 African countries have mainstream trade in their national development plans as well as in their budget priorities. And in terms of capacity development, we've built capacity of 17,000 officials, just trained them on WTO and trade related matters in Africa. And in terms of policy reform, an independent evaluation conducted of the EIF back in 2021 found that about 25% of trade reforms in LDCs were linked to EIF intervention. And we've supported more than 28,000 MSME across 24 countries in Africa. And in terms of market access and market entry opportunities, 280 transactions were facilitated across 17 African LDCs, generating US $950 million in exports. And in terms of regional integration, we supported 33 countries in the implementation of AFCFTA, which was just discussed. And in terms of the engagement in the WTO accession, and this is interesting that we've already supported countries such as Liberia and Comoros in the process of their accession, not only in the process of their accession, but also to implement some of their priority reform agenda, which are identified as a part of their accession package. We are currently supporting Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia as well in their accession process. So these are the kind of a software support that we normally describe, but we've also provided hardware kind of support, which are absolutely critical for the LDCs to take advantage of market access opportunities. And there, I just want to provide three examples. One is the example of the cross-border market centers. There are two cross-border market centers we've supported in Rwanda, in Karunji, as well as a place called Burera, where we've supported the cross-border construction of cross-border market center. And we've supported metrology lab in Guinea, ICT systems in Senegal, and cargo complex at the Banjul International Airport in the Gambia. So these are basically the kind of support that we have provided so far. I just want to provide one small example of how some of the regional initiatives have helped in countries taking advantage of trade opportunities. So there's a project that we implemented together with Global Share Alliance, covering 4 countries, a regional project covering countries such as Benin, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Togo. And there, the tiny little support of 2.5 million was provided, and the Global Share Alliance was able to mobilize additional resources from other partners, including USAID and other private sector partners. And as a result of the project, they were able to increase their production by 779% over a period of 4 years of the implementation of the project, but at the same time provided support to more than 30,000 women who were involved in various cooperatives that were formed as a part of the project. And they were able to export shear products worth 21 million to various markets. And we've also helped them to expand their market to the Asian market rather than just focusing on the European market. So we supported them to diversify their exports to countries such as Singapore, Korea, China, and India. And this helped create 2,500 full-time job opportunities. So that's the kind of project implementation track record that the EIF has. Now, moving on to the third phase of the program, I just want to highlight the fact that we are now not only focusing on trade, but also on investment. Investment is and trade are part of the same coin, but then, we have to now start working on investment. That realization came from the fact that we started a pilot project with World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies back in 2018, which helped us to assist LDCs in attracting foreign direct investment. But then the other major focus of the phase 3 of the program is to build resilience. For us, building resilience is important in the context of polycrisis that we are facing, and this was also mentioned by previous speakers. But institutional capacity building and productive capacity building are the ways to ensure resilience in these countries. So therefore, we are supporting that kind of initiative. And then our cross-cutting priorities that we have identified are climate resilience, gender equality, youth employment, and digital transformation. So let me spend a bit, a minute or two on how we can support LDCs to take part in the WTO reform agenda and implement some of the priority actions, as well as to use the EIF support, to leverage the EIF support to advance their industrialization objective in order to build their structural productive capacity, enhance their structural transformation, and be part of the global value chain system, and in the process build their resilience. So what we've done is now we have two types of modality through which we provide support to LDCs as a part of the phase 3 of the program. First is what is known as country program document. We help countries to prepare country program document for a period of 5 years, covering in a period from 2026 to 2030. And just to let you know that we are going to launch the EIF phase 3 in the sideline of the ministerial, and the phase 3 will last from now. It has just started, but it will last until 2031, in line with the Doha program of action for LDCs. So as a part of that program, the country program document, there will be possibility for countries to use part of the institutional support that we provide to countries to implement, to participate effectively in the WTO reform discussion and implement some of the priority actions. But the other kind of support that is provided as a country program document is what is known as productive capacity building support. And this would help them to address some of the key bottlenecks and challenges, in particularly supply side constraints. So once that is done, the other window that we have identified is the window called regional window, which could be few countries coming together to implement trade facilitation reform, few countries coming together to enhance their connectivity or transport related agenda. So those are the kind of support that we could provide in the form of regional project support, but also a kind of a thematic project support that can be provided, where few countries can come together and want to implement, let's say, a climate resilience agenda, women economic empowerment, or youth employment. Those are the kind of things that we could support in the phase 3 of the program. Our target is to mobilize 200 million US dollar, and that's a huge challenge, a tall order. I hope we will be able to do so. Not exactly by the time of the ministerial. We've so far only mobilized $23 million. But then ministerial conference will also be used as an opportunity for some of the donors to make their announcement. And then the launch event would be a platform for that. And beyond that also, we would like to work not only with the traditional donor, but also with South-South partners, for which we are making considerable effort in order to attract South-South partners. We are also planning to work with various other innovative financing mechanism and foundations and instruments, such as philanthropies, then the provider of blended finance and impact investors. So I'd like to stop here and would be happy to come back again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratnaka, even for talking about what to expect for the phase 3 launch next year in Yaoundé. And now I'd like to move to you, Caroline, and talk about the trade and sustainability nexus. And more specifically, we're curious to hear, looking ahead, how you see the interplay between sustainability and WTO reform, and whether also you can give us some updates on recent developments based on the conversations ongoing at the WTO CTE. So welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Janet. It's really a pleasure to join you, and thank you also to ODI and the Trade Negotiations and Investment Forum for inviting me to speak. today. It's always great to hear Ambassador Mohammed's remarks and perspectives. And one thing I just wanted to note at the beginning is that Tess just published an excellent article by Ambassador Mohammed yesterday, and it's called "For a Just Transition, Trade Cooperation should focus on areas of highest impact for both climate and development." And I wanted to mention that at the beginning because it's very much the perspective that our organization, my organization, TESS, brings to these discussions. So what I wanted to do briefly with the remarks today, following your questions, Janet, is to try and bring a bit of a perspective from Geneva. We work in the multilateral setting, and really what's happening in Geneva around some of these issues at the nexus of trade, development, and climate or sustainability, but particularly in the context of the WTO reform discussion, and in the lead up to MC14. So just the first thing I wanted to note is that this week is Reform Week at the WTO. There's a series of consultations that the former chair of the General Council, Ambassador Olberg from Norway, is running. And there are three themes that have emerged as the core focus at this time. So one is around decision making, one is around development and SDT, and the other is around what they call level playing field issues. So there is this theme around development issues that many of you have emphasized today. And I'm sure that many of the countries from your region and other developing countries will indeed be insisting on the relevance of that to the WTO reform discussion, but also trying to offer concrete suggestions of what future work on that could look like. So I just wanted to note that there's been strong and consistent messaging from African delegations in Geneva around what WTO reform should prioritize. Broadly speaking, if I look across the recent proposals and statements in the General Council, it's clear that they are characterizing the reform agenda as an opportunity to shape a trading system that better delivers on long-standing calls for development. This includes for structural transformation, economic diversification, resilience building, and sustainable development. There's consistent calls for inclusivity, capacity, awareness, and fairness. And there's also been I think, a message that whilst there's a recognition that a range of changes in the global economy, so climate crisis, supply chain shocks, sustainability standards, the digital agenda, and so on, will require changes to the multilateral system, that the system also needs to remain rooted in the development priorities and needs of weaker economies. So from this regard, there's something of a rejection of a reform agenda that's only driven by new trade issues if those undermine development priorities. So there's really a sense of just anchoring the reform agenda. It's not an opposition to talking about those. I think in general, it's more an emphasis on the need to ensure that it's consistent with the wider development agenda. One of the things I'm happy to share with others, I sort of compiled a sense of some of the specific things that African countries have emphasized in their statements. So, for example, South Africa has said, and this is a quote from them, development is central in any discussions on reform, as is the meaningful implementation of SDT. WTO reform must be guided by principles of inclusivity, equity, and development. This has been echoed in statements from Nigeria, Mozambique, Tanzania, Namibia, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Djibouti, and Lesotho. It's a very broadly expressed set of priorities. An emphasis that while the institution does need to adapt to new realities, it has to preserve some of these foundational principles. I think, Mozambique, on behalf of the Africa Group statement, explicitly says that emerging issues must be sequenced to avoid sidelining core development priorities, such as agriculture, SDT, and capacity building. Interestingly, now moving a little bit more to the sustainability issues where TESS works, many countries note in their interventions across a range of WTO committees, African countries, note this, and in public presentations, that there's a need for enhanced cooperation on sustainability and climate, fundamentally because it has development and competitiveness implications for their countries. So I don't see a push not to discuss these issues. It's just that they need to be anchored in a way that responds to the priorities. And Patrick has already highlighted that a core part of that priority is the vulnerabilities, risk to supply chains, and challenges of adaptation, especially in the face of climate shocks and low onset climate change. That's really critical to both the development and trade needs of many developing countries, but particularly in Africa. So this is something, it's a perspective that I think is starting to gain some recognition, but needs a lot more emphasis, because for many of the countries, this is really a core way in which the trade and climate or trade and sustainability nexus is relevant for their trade and development. At the same time, there's a strong cross-cutting emphasis, sort of a recognition of the need for trade-related action and measures, but a concern for the design and implementation of those measures. So particularly on, recognizing the proliferation of trade-related climate measures, measures on deforestation, a range of non-tariff measures around sustainability and so on. So, for example, in the African group statement, they note that climate trade measures must avoid protectionism, reflect common but differentiated responsibilities, and support Africa's green industrialization. Many countries in their statements have also highlighted specifically the implications for agriculture of proliferating non-tariff measures on the environment. And Djibouti, on behalf of the LDC group in the past, and a range of countries like Rwanda and Kenya, have noted the importance of climate adaptation and food security as part of this wider and trade and sustainability discussion. South Africa and Nigeria have both really emphasized the importance of having the preservation and expansion of policies for developing countries in space for it to implement industrial policies aligned with their national development strategies. Notably, Mozambique, in this statement on behalf of the African group, specifically made reference that climate trade measures must avoid protectionism and support Africa's green industrialization. So I thought it's worth highlighting that, so it's useful to know what countries that many of you are from are actually prioritizing in the context of WTO reform discussions, both on the development side and also on the sustainability side. Just quickly, more broadly around climate and trade, many of you will have noticed that at COP30, there's increasing emphasis and recognition of the relevance of trade in the climate crisis, and also on the need for cooperation on trade that supports not only urgently needed action on the climate crisis, but also is aligned with the sort of development or climate resilient development priorities of countries. So we saw parties at UNFCCC initiate a new process of dialogue on trade and climate. Brazil also launched a new international forum on climate change and trade, which is aiming to be a new place bringing together both the climate and trade community for informal dialogue and solution building on trade and climate. And meanwhile, at the WTO, there's a range of work underway on climate and trade in the context of the Committee on Trade and Environment, in the member-led initiatives, which a number of African countries are part of, such as the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability and the fossil fuel subsidies reform initiative. So we would expect at MC14 that the TESD and the FFSR initiative will produce an update on their work, possibly some technical outcome documents, possibly statements from ministers or from the co-leads of those initiatives. But I think where really the core emphasis is at the moment of members is in the CTE. There's been something of a revival of discussions in the Committee on Trade and Environment, particularly with an interest in generating guidance on trade-related climate measures. A number of members are really hoping that this might be able to be produced in advance of MC14. And here, the focus that they have tried to be looking on a focus where they may be able to generate some shared understandings among members, and the focus is on non-binding governance guidance on methodologies for measuring embedded emissions. I'm happy to share updates on that with others. At TESS, we published a paper a few months ago highlighting the range of different proposals on this and noting that there are really 4 themes driving members' engagement on TRCMs, One is around coherence and reducing fragmentation, and coherence between the trade and the climate regime. A second theme is around transparency of measures. A third is around development. And a fourth is around looking for sort of pragmatic ways to improve interoperability and mutual recognition of measures. The African group has been engaged in those discussions. They have made submissions specifically on the issue of TRCMs. The Africa group, for example, has has highlighted the implications of unilateral measures on developing countries, and has also called for a principles-based approach that ensures that developing countries' interests are reflected in the design of measures and contribute to a wider sustainable development framework. The ACP group also called for enhanced cooperation to promote harmonization and mutual recognition. And more recently, as I noted, in a range of different WTO committees, not just the CTE, a number of African countries consistently raised the importance of adaptation as a core issue for them, priority for them for building cooperation in the climate and trade nexus. I'm sure I've come almost to the end of my time, but just to close by saying, I really think that MC13 is an opportunity. Well, we know it's an opportunity to frame the WTO reform agenda going forward. I don't think we can expect any big decisions at WTO reform, at MC13 on WTO reform, but they may set a framework, hopefully for more outcome-oriented dialogue in the coming years. So obviously, it's important to continue to emphasize the development priorities of your region, to underline some of the fantastic work that's going on in the region already, and to make sure that that's visible, the sort of positive agenda that you are pursuing regionally on these topics. But I think it's also important to make this link between the sustainability and development dimensions. And on that note, just to note at MC13, the African group as a collective signed on to a developing country statement on the contribution of the multilateral trading system to tackle environmental challenges. That was a ministerial statement signed by 63 countries. It's a great statement. It remains equally relevant today as it was then, highlighted a range of priorities and concerns and also pathways forward. I won't go into those now, but just to note that. And also that the vast majority of countries in the WTO made their ministers in their individual statements referred to the importance of development and sustainability issues. And a number of African countries highlighted the importance of this in their statements as well. So I hope that's a useful overview of sort of what countries are saying at the moment at the WTO, countries from your region are saying, and where some of the opportunities lie. Thank you again.
Thank you, Caroline. And I can see we're a bit over time at this point, and I'll ask that we have a mic ready to circulate, because now we are getting to the point where we want now the dialogue between all of you, the participants and the members of the panel. And as that happens, I'll just allow Dr. Jody to just give some final concluding remarks. And as you ask the question, make your contribution, please say your name and the organization where you're from, and then proceed to ask your question. And make it short and sweet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janet. So just to kind of follow on from the excellent panel and all of the great interventions, I think it's important to kind of emphasize what Carolyn kind of concluded there, that, as we look ahead to MC14 on the reform agenda, there's unlikely to be any major outcome, but it will be a kind of incremental process. And I'm very pleased that you picked up on the recent African group statements that have been made in relation to WTO reform and so on. So just in my kind of final reflection, just to kind of help summarize before we move to the Q&A, I think it is really important to keep in mind the kind of context. So, when I was back here in Nairobi in 2015, there was still a lot of optimism about the role of the multilateral trading system. I can remember very well EIF phase 2 getting off on the ground and raising resources and so on. So as we look ahead to the next ministerial conference to be held in Africa, the trading landscape has just changed dramatically. Not only have we got the kind of the damaging role of big players like the US. But we've also got a very constrained donor environment and landscape as well. So just to pick up on the point that Ratnika made, the pledging conference of the phase 3 enhanced integrated framework, we have to try to remain optimistic that resources can be secured, but I think we also have to be quite realistic as well, and to think about how the kind of model of delivery of the type of aid for trade will change in the future, and thinking about the kind of role and better relationship with investors and securing different sources of finance as well. So it has to be about bringing in investment. And so I think that's why it's really exciting, actually, when we then think about the role of the AFCFTA, the fact that, since 2018, the process has been ongoing, and you have all of the right ingredients now in place to really help drive that transformation. So, when I was kind of reading the African Group statement, I can see very clearly this reference to the Africa's Green Industrialization Initiative, but also the kind of imperative of structural economic transformation. And that is really at the heart of the AFCFTA and the AGII working together. So there are huge opportunities, but I think we also have to be very alive to the risks of fragmentation. I think it's been alluded to in some of the earlier points in relation to trade-related climate measures, about different MRV systems and so on, but critical minerals and the kind of new approaches and the soft law approaches, I think that's something that we also really need to pay far greater attention to as well. So I'll stop there and move on to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Judy. So we have opened the floor officially for Q&A, and we'll just scan the room to see whether we have any questions, any comments. Oh, yes, I can see a few hands going around. There's one here. We have two more here. So, okay, we'll start.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Max Mendefara from ODI Global. And thank you very much. Excellent panel. Very interesting discussion. I want to touch base on the three core functions on the WTO that Pat was referencing. And you can see that there are things going on there. I mean, they are completely unoperational, because there are negotiations happening at the moment. I mean, potentially in digital trade, the dispute settlement, the appellate body is not working, but you have basically the value of the dispute settlement is there. So countries, basically members, are adopting the MBIA actually to tackle that. So what we are not seeing is the sort of big negotiation rounds that used to happen in the past, and this is sort of you need to think of basically that there seems to be a bit of a tension. There is basically on what the WTO should be and actually what the WTO can be, and this is sort of reflective of basically what the WTO should basically be following what countries members are doing and approach it, or basically there should be potentially a convergence place where actually all countries should come. And the concrete question I have is, in that sort of tension that is a sort of underlying in the reform, what are eventually the sort of core principles under which the WTO is founded that could be negotiated, and what are those that we should stick to them? So, I mean, it was mentioned basically, well, the consensus rule probably have to be reviewed, but I wonder whether we need to effectively consider in a more variable geometric approach to agreements. Wonder whether, I'm not saying that, but basically whether the MFN principle have to be revised, whether in response to some of the security concerns that countries are having and some of the development concerns as well, whether, for example, the possibility of introducing some disciplines now allowing some quantitative restrictions on export, something that is happening at the moment, de facto should be considered. So my question is basically, what needs to be in the reform of the WTO are the principles that are to be negotiated, can be negotiated, and what are those that we want to keep because are sort of more of the normative side of what the world trade system should be.
Thank you. We have I hope we've all taken note of the question. We will probably go around the panel.
Thank you, Janet. My name is Soit. I'm from the University of Cambridge. And my question is with regards to the after. So perhaps just to Miss Rosalind, sorry, thank you. So we've learned so much from the failure of the dispute system at the WTO. And perhaps my question is, what are we going to do differently for after? Because trade disputes are inevitable. So what exactly are you trying to do to prevent a similar occurrence with the WTO system?
Thank you, Soit. We had two hands on this side, so we'll probably take the last two questions and then I'll go around the panel and we'll see if we have another round of questions.
Good morning. My name is PAQ Ruth Kirima Barry of Cornerstone Limited. We work on a Pan-African diaspora panel. And really more a comment to Rosalind rather than a question. I find that in mining in Africa is very erratic, with us here in Kenya getting 1% of GDP, Uganda and Tanzania 10%, Botswana 25%. And yet, because of, I would say, lack of support of Pan-African trading, we're still importing minerals from Brazil. So I would say, I think we need your services, we need your guidance, we need your training, just to use already what Pan-Africa has to build ourselves rather than to look outside. So I look forward to continuing the discussion with you, Rosalind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just take the gentleman at the back. Last question for this.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Moses Moshiri Mwangi. I'm an economist and international trade and development at the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya. My question is mostly based on AFTA, and given the reality of we as an African continent, as an aggregate, we are still a small economy based on our contribution to the global international trade landscape in terms of goods and services. And also given the fact that being small exposes us to the global risk. And in this case, we are seeing international trade mostly going on the way of being transactional, and therefore a disintegration of the global rules. And with this bearing in mind the risk that we are being exposed, what is after doing, especially in this case? And I feel we should throw our weight behind multilateral rules, and it seems we are not doing that as much. And what are we planning to do on that? And what is likely to play out in case that does not happen, given that multivectoral approach and transactional and Africa with the world might not be that beneficial to us? Thank you.
We all got those? Okay, so I will turn it over to the panelists, starting with you, Rosalind, and we'll go in that order. Whichever question you want to pick up is okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you so very much for the interest of getting more on the Africa Continental Free Trade, AFCFTA. Let me start with the dispute settlement. Indeed, the WTO system has been overly politicized, very, very costly, very timely. And currently, we of course have a protocol on dispute settlement that is operational at the moment, and the appellate body is also constituted. So what the FCFTA is doing differently is having a development Africa-centric, of course it is Africa, so it is Africa-centric Africa needs, as it were. What makes us different? Ensuring that we have, of course, our trained negotiators, arbitrators within the appellate body, within the AfCFTA, ensuring that we also have access for the SMEs. So there's that access, seeing how the cost would be done. And I had a note that I was making reference to. What is being done is mandatory consultations and mediation stages. So those are mandatory, and allowing for the AfCFTA Secretariat settlements, facilitated settlements. So that is what is being done. Since I'm not the expert, I can only say that much. And then to just comment on what Max has said, but not really speaking on what is currently ongoing, as it were, but just saying what should really be reflected is the priorities that Africa has. So how should we reflect this? We need to ensure that the discussions, the negotiations facilitate the digital trade with the fair trade, fair data governance, and support the green transition measures without green protectionism. And also looking at what we have under the AfCFTA, the complete umbrella of the protocols. These are regional disciplines that intentionally integrate sustainability safeguards, development finance, investment facilitation, MSME participation, climate alignment. And so what then should be reflected is that the rules that we are negotiating, the reforms that we want to see now, should really support the building of productive capacities as opposed to simply accelerating the market opening. So what are those productive capacities that we need to build? So around the structural transformation that all the protocols of the AfCFTA have, what are those components that are already reflected in those disciplines that we have, and how can we reflect it in the reform process? And then speaking now to the point of, the market share, we have around 3% trade share. The discussion at the moment is, can we look inward? What is our own intra-Africa trade? We see that a lot of our trade is external. How do we ensure that we try and undertake actually intra-Africa trade? It is simpler, it is cheaper for us. And then it is also goods that we are more amenable to. We relate to, there is a nearshoring factors. And so it now boils down to the policymakers to say, how do we simplify that intra-Africa trade? How do we transition the codification of the rules that are already there under the AfCFTA into the implementation? Remember what we said in the beginning. The businessman will not look at what your rules are. They will look at, what is my profit line? What is the cost? Is it easy for me to bring it from Europe, from China, or from across the border? So if we make it very difficult to bring our goods from across the border, then the businessman will bring it from external. So how do we ensure that we address those barriers that we have cross-border, the non-tariff barriers or the tariff barriers that we have? So the rules are already there. It is the implementation. It is really the implementation. And it is similar to what is being asked around the mining sector. What Botswana has done is ensuring that there is value addition on ground. There is no negotiation about that. You must add value, and the quality of the jobs that you have within the sector of the mining in Botswana is high quality. The technology transfer is, so is it what we are transposing internally? So we have, under the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative, the component critical minerals. So critical minerals discussion right now is to say we need to value add. So we need the regional value chains to ensure that we take what we have in the continent. So supporting that policy element, the the permitting process. So an example for the EV, but the batteries for the EV, we need the lithium, the cobalt. The approach will not be national. It will not work. So we need to look at regional and continental so that we take advantage of the critical minerals that we have and value add. If we don't then do that, we will continue to import because it is easier and cheaper, and we will continue to export the raw materials. And remember, we are importing the same finished product value added that we have sent out as raw materials. So again, it is how do we support that regional value chain, that nearshoring, and it is within the implementation components. We have provided the disciplines, we have provided the frameworks. It is the implementation. Thank you.
Thanks. Just a few points on dispute settlement. It is true that there is an MPIA, which is supposed to be explicitly a temporary substitute to what was there before and was broken down when the dispute settlement body was no longer able to constitute itself. The appellate body. The trouble now with the MPIA is it requires the public spiritedness of the two parties to the dispute. Because just recently there was a case against the Americans and they just appealed it into the void because the appellate body still exists on paper. So either you get rid of the appellate body or you make it work. To hear that AFCFTA have got an appellate body. So I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, so I don't know which would be preferable, but one way or the other, either we have to have a functioning dispute settlement body or it's got the books. There's been some discussion, I've heard some discussions sort of around Geneva about what the emphasis should be in the next ministerial in Yaoundé, whether it should be on seeking out opportunities for having more joint statement initiatives, which basically are MFN, so far, MFN-based initiatives that do not require a consensus to launch, and nor to close, but they have to be MFN so far. So if you want a free ride on one of those, you can, but that's partly what the problem is. The other problem is that it's very hard to see small countries being able to take the initiative to actually develop one of these things. So I don't think it's a particularly fair instrument, but it's probably better than nothing happening. I completely share what you're saying about the African continent, but I think another big element is physical infrastructure. Because I can still remember, I'm old enough to remember when if you were in Kenya and you wanted to phone Côte d'Ivoire, you had to go through Paris and London with the telephone call. Well, I think we've got better than that, but you know what? That was the colonial heritage. All the straight lines on the maps and all this. That's what's got to come. That's what AFCFTA should be all about. Is all about, I think. And I have to say, so far I'm a bit of an optimist. Okay.
Sure. Thank you. So in terms of what should the WTO's function be and sort of how do we approach this, Max? Completely agree with sort of the premise of the question. I'm going to not take a technical answer, but sort of more of a populist one. We need ministers to be interested. It needs to be the top three things on the agenda because right now WTO reform isn't. It's right down the bottom of all your sort of bilateral ministerial statements. If you read them, WTO reform's normally on the second page, right down the bottom. It's not your top three trade issues. And I think unless it is, and unless you're getting that political attention at that ministerial level, Geneva's not going to move. It really does need much, much more of a focus and attraction in order to see that progress move forward. I think part of that is stuff that ministers are interested in. Sustainability, digital, absolutely key points on the agenda. But I also think they need to see their own economic interests in the WTO reform discussions. And that's going to be hard because there are some pretty big fundamental disagreements among WTO members at the moment. We've been quite polite here today in terms of the conversation, but those disagreements in Geneva between countries and between WTO members are quite fundamental. I'm going to sort of recount a couple of vignettes of conversations I've had with US trade policymakers in the past month, where they say, you know, they disagree that it's because of US actions that the system's disintegrating. The damage was done well before the current administration. We need to talk about the redistribution of gains because they've been materially harmed by the trade actions of others. It's not about safeguarding the current system. We need to tackle overcapacity, global imbalances, forced labor. The appellate bodies and national security issue, everyone can off because we're not going to discuss it. And by the way, MFN is actually an impediment to trade liberalization because we want to move forward with others and don't want to give it to everyone else because of some national security concerns. So these are the types of attitudes that we're up against. Yes, we need multilateral cooperation, but the barriers to getting that trust back in order to make progress, I think it does need a fundamental rethink in some areas, and it will need to start in that variable geometry because a big multilateral decision on WTO reform, I agree with what Carolyn said, is not going to be achieved the next ministerial, but we might get to a process by which we can get there.
Gonna listen from Ratnakar and Caroline, and then we move over to Ambassador and Dr. Jody for your reflections. Yeah, so start with you, Ratnakar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to pick up from where Rosalind left off. In relation to what we are trying to do in LDC, at least in LDCs in Africa, is precisely to build their capacity, build their productive capacity so that they can participate in global value chain. The critical minerals bit that was discussed earlier is very important, whether it's cobalt in DRC, bauxite in Guinea, copper in Zambia, or graphite in Mozambique, or lithium in Mali. This is precisely what we aim to do in the long run. So we want to build their capacity so that they could process in their own countries, following the fascinating example of Botswana that was just mentioned. So that's for that purpose, what we are trying to do is to provide, let's say, feasibility study support to countries. And this is a support that we have been providing in the past also. Project preparation grant to help countries to develop a bankable or investment ready project that that can be used to leverage additional resources from various partners, such as the private sector partners, or impact investors, or even climate finance institutions. So this is just one example that I want to provide, and stop here. Is the example of Gambia, where we provided support for the preparation of a bankable project for the construction of special economic zone in it's called agri economic zone in agri special economic zone in a place close to their capital Banjul. We provided support worth $450,000, and they were able to prepare a bankable project worth $104 million, and have applied for funding to Green Climate Fund, and they are in the process of getting this approved. So this is the kind of a power of aid for trade that we want to leverage in order to help countries to build their industrial capacity. And another example is we are currently negotiating with an impact investment facility for the for conducting a feasibility study for geothermal energy in East Africa, in the Great Rift Valley, which has a capacity of altogether the theoretical capacity of 20,000 megawatt of geothermal energy, focusing particularly in three countries, Tanzania, Uganda, and Comoros, to see how we could conduct a feasibility, how we could look at the feasibility of starting a relatively big project there with the support of the impact investors and possibly other financing institutions such as Green Climate Fund in order to support this initiative. So these are the kind of things that we would like to do. WTO reform is one agenda which is important, which would help provide relative predictability and may also provide pathways for inclusion of some of the new issues and agenda, whether through a plurilateral track or multilateral track. But our objective is to make sure that these countries, particularly LDCs, are able to take advantage of the opportunity that are offered by the WTO reform process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would just like to echo, actually, I thought George made a great point on the need for ministers to be interested. My reflection, and I'm sure Ambassador Mohammed has this reflection as well, for things to move in the WTO, there need to be a core group of ministers, 3 or 4 ministers who really invest political energy in engaging and driving something forward. That's the same at the ambassador level. And it's the same at the technical level as well. I think the WTO reform discussions are being led at, or largely driven at the moment by at the DPR level in Geneva. So we really need to think about who are the champions of these, especially around the development issues in the reform agenda. And I guess I can't emphasize that enough. And that will also require backing from capitals, from stakeholders, from think tanks, from regional organizations, because Geneva is a city where countries need to hustle. It's not enough to submit a paper to be right on the issue. It's a matter of working out how to drive forward the issue. And I think that this is something that it's very difficult for resource-constrained missions to do in Geneva. Many of them are covering hundreds of issues in a dozen different international organizations. So we just have to think really hard about that resource constraint, because I was thinking as others were speaking that I published a book 10 years ago that gathered developing country perspectives on global trade governance and WTO reform. A lot of all of this has been said before. It's been said for a really long time. So the question is, how can you move the needle? And I think one of the things that that was referred to as well is sort of having a bit of a reality check at the WTO, because on the narrative and the mood. So the challenge with the SDT discussion is that it's central for developing countries and for African countries, symbolically, politically, technically, but it's also one where there's a huge amount of fatigue from other WTO members. So I think there's something to be done to kind of sustain attention to the core elements of that, while also trying to be pragmatic and looking for ways to get some of the concrete economic needs and opportunities that you have identified, for example, in the regional context, to be addressed. So there's something sort of pragmatic about that. I was also thinking that, there's a lot of, it might be worth thinking about how to frame that sort of African development and trade agenda in a way that is explicitly sort of appealing to how addressing that will help address stability in the system more broadly and prosperity in the system more broadly, just to sort of get buy-in from some of these developed countries that are frankly a bit tired of it all and are keen to move on. That's the reality. And they should be allowed to move on. I mean, many of the issues there remain as pressing as they were 20 years ago, but people have become bored with it. So we have to work out, how do you generate engagement on that? And the last thing I wanted just to mention on the sustainability issues, I mean, I'm the first to recognize these are not going to be, especially with the preoccupations of the US at the moment, climate and sustainability issues are not going to be a top line issue at MC14. But I do think we really need to understand, especially on the adaptation front, how critical these are to the economic viability of countries, to their economic prospects going forward. One thing we can do, Kenya, because you're all in Nairobi today, is one of the 4 co-leads of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate. They will have a ministerial meeting the day before MC14. in Cameroon. And there's an opportunity to use that to provide some messaging about what some of the African and developing country priorities are on trade, climate, cooperation in the context of development priorities. So I just highlight it as a tool that might be useful in that work as you go forward. But thank you again for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to allow Ambassador to weigh in on this, and please note that because we have a few minutes, I think I can play moderator's discretion and allow any other reflections or reactions from the room, and maybe a final word or two from our panelists, and then we'll stop. Ambassador, please.
Well, thank you very, very much. First of all, extremely interesting, I think, session. I wish we could actually continue for much, much longer. But some of the things that I've taken away from this really esteemed, panelists and those that have spoken both here and, virtually, is you really cannot do much without political will and interest. And I think George nailed that, perfectly. If governments are not interested, and I think I would even go beyond the ministers and say that if the heads of state and government are not interested in the agenda, it's very difficult then for the ministers to actually carry out any meaningful discussions and conversations. So it really has to be at that level. Now, who can get us that interest at that level? I think for the continent, just speaking for this continent, it's the African FCFTA. They can get that interest from the heads of state because they interact with them at different levels. So again, I'm just throwing the ball back in that court. Hopefully, you can get us there by just making sure that there's a prioritization of trade and obviously sustainability in all the discussions that take place. And I think that all of us know that if we actually engage meaningfully, then there's a real chance of a reduction in poverty, as has happened in other parts of the world, also happening here. I think I just remember my days at the WTO, and most of you who are here can actually remember that. The excitement around deliberations, the excitement about rulemaking, about negotiations, even the excitement about the DSP. I mean, when I chaired it, the rooms were always extremely full and the engagements were real and very energetic and very persuasive. So I actually miss all that, because then you had a feeling that things were happening and the things that were happening were changing the dynamics, just across the board. But we also had engagement from international institutions that has just been mentioned, but by Caroline. We had meetings and they were quite frequent, not as frequently as we would have liked, but all these institutions obviously have their own, priorities to take care of as well. But the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, even WHO, we had these meetings that happened UNCTAD. They happened, and in some ways, I think there was some alignment. There was a big envelope, for instance, at the World Bank and the IMF to support, trade negotiations, to support capacity building in developing countries and all that. So I hope that at some point after Yaoundé, we can persuade everybody that there is a need for all these institutions to kind of start talking to each other. I'm not saying that we should go back to those days. I think those days are really gone. But we should see whether we can come up with a different way of these organizations working together. The disconnect between Geneva and capitals, that's real. It's always been there, but now that gap is huge. It's really big. And it's not the fault of developing countries, by the way, because the big powers, as has been mentioned by others, are not talking to each other as much, or at least are talking to each other at crossroads, as well. It's become, the space, the multilateral space, whether it is sustainability or trade, is kind of shrinking. And at the altar of national interest, at the altar of, the domestic agenda. And there's that lethargy that you feel when you go to Geneva, and I think Patrick has kind of described it, perfectly. So what do we really, hope for? It's been said that that political will not be at the level that we want it to be in Yaoundé. And so if at Yaoundé, we can get what Caroline has described as a lead team of ministers who have an interest, a passion, energy to see whether they can actually drive aspects of this multilateral trade agenda forward and get other people interested. And it actually does happen. If you have a lead team of ministers doing the work, you'll see that there's interest from others. You don't want to be left out. You don't want to be left behind. There's a feeling that the interests of your country will not be represented if you're not at the table. But there has to be that energy that is kind of driving it. Before it was the mini ministerials, that helped because there would be a limited number of ministers there. But it would be a representative group from all parts of the WTO, developing, least developed, and everybody else. And so you actually had real conversations around the tables. They were short, they were focused, they were results oriented, and we came back from there feeling that there was some kind of community that had been formed that would drive the agenda forward. So I think that I don't know how we can persuade that to happen, because again, the drivers of the multilateral system are kind of absent, or at least not adequately present, if I may say. The whole discussion about FCFTA has done brilliant work, really. So far, well done. I think the next step has to be obviously what Patrick was also talking about. The deficits that we must address. There's the infrastructure deficit. And it doesn't matter how well connected you are with the rules, right? If we don't have that conviction that we must address that, and we must address it urgently. And today there's a possibility of getting that done in record time. You don't have to build a road for 50 years now. It will take you a much shorter time because technology has really shifted, the playground. And so if we can really focus and say, okay, these rules are amazing, they're wonderful. Everybody needs to, have them, adopted at least in their countries, right? But as you do this, you need to address these other deficits. There's infrastructure, there's a capacity deficit as well. And then there is that need to engage the private sector fully. They don't care about the processes. All of you have said that, right? They really don't care about everything that these discussions that take place. What they really want to see is an ease of doing business. They want to be able to do business without thinking too deeply about some of these things. So there has to be continuous engagement, at least at the regional level, with the private sector. I think a wonderful roadshow, right, through the continent, with the regional, bodies, right, talking about the role of the private sector. It can drive this by putting pressure on government. They are the main taxpayers, right? And so what they say, government kind of, listens to. So that would be, I think, it has to be the next, stage of what we do. I think I'm going to stop there because I have I have a lot to say about this, and I do not want to take up too much time. On sustainability, I fully agree with what Patrick has said. And I think what Jody said during other sessions that we have had, on where the emphasis have to be. Yeah? And of course, we need to address industrial policy. I think that is a no-brainer. I'm going to stop there so I don't hog the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I was scanning the room to see whether there's any urgent interventions, and I see none. Yes, I'm not. Well, I will. Okay, so I will allow Ambassador Nelson Ndirango to very briefly ask a question or make some reflections, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Jody, who will close the session for us.
Thank you very much. And let me say this session has been very good. For me, it was reminding me of the things that used to happen in Geneva many years ago. Let me also say that from the discussion, the WTO is still relevant. We still need it. So what we need to ask ourselves, how do we reinvigorate it? And I think as we go towards Yaoundé, we will probably fill in some gaps. Patrick Law talked about leadership, that the US is disinterested. I would like to hear your views or the views of the panel who can take over the leadership so that we get something meaningful at Yaoundé. The second point I needed to raise is regarding the AFCFTA. And thank you very much, Roslyn, for your presentation. I think we can use the paralysis in the WTO to make sure that the AFCFTA is fully operational. We move away from the guided trade initiative, and we implement it in full. And that way, we can show the rest of the world that we mean business. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Nelson Dirango, and see, you and Patrick will side chat. I can see that he's obviously, there was a question addressed to him on who he thinks can take leadership, but I'll allow, unless you want to make a quick reaction to that, Dr. Jody to close.
Yeah, just to say very briefly, I think one of the issues on leadership is up until, I'd say maybe up until the Uruguay round, you had a sort of hegemonic leadership structure with the Americans. The question now is, can we have something other than a hegemon that works? Because I think that's going to be the reality.
Thank you very much to all of you here in the audience, especially Ambassador Amina and Ambassador Nelson. And thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for joining us here in person, but also online. I think we've covered a tremendous amount of ground. It was really helpful to ground this conversation and this session kind of reflecting back to 2015 and the Nairobi package that was agreed and looking ahead to 2026 and the realities of what we can expect. So I just really extend my deep appreciation to every panelist. I think you've had, different perspectives from each participant, but also very helpful and concrete suggestions actually on the way forward. Kind of one of my take homes really is, that I think we all need to kind of reflect more fundamentally about the kind of role of the trading system and different levels of trade policy making and how this supports kind of broader economic development, encompassing all of the different social and environmental dimensions. So a huge thanks. We will have a meeting report as well, so we hope to share that with you all. But thank you very much for joining us here for this morning's session. We'll now break for lunch, and then we'll move into session 2, which will be on sustainability. Thank you.